So we want to continue with some remarks on the text Al-Waraqat by Imam al-Juwayni, rahmatullahi alayhi. Firstly, this terse, very small text is written in the discipline of Usul al-Fiqh. It is extremely terse. That's why it's called Al-Waraqat. Al-Waraqat, basically in the Arabic language, indicates to a few pages can be written in anything, but the idea here is al-qillah, or terseness or conciseness. Imam al-Juwayni rahmatullahi alayhi is one of those scholars who is considered min muassisin al-fan. He's one of those who's foundational in setting out, laying out the framework that we encounter in the discipline itself. Or he's one that has a rooted, grounded presence in the writing and in the dealing with the topic or the discipline of Usul Fiqh. There's a few points that I wanted to make with regard to the text that are beneficial for Talib al-Ilm. One is that the structure of the text is not necessarily logical the way that we see in many texts. In other words, it's not organized by a tight internal logic, so that there's a visible understanding of the connection between one point and another point with regard to the themes. So he has 24 themes that he's covering, and the organization of those themes is not necessarily an organization which we see a logical progressive flow. So theme A tied to theme B tied to theme C, and then these themes are tied to theme D, and the organization of how it is that A, B, and C ties in with D makes sense. No, we don't encounter that. Imam al-Juwayni, rahmatullahi alayhi, it appears that he presented what he considered to be essential as a starting point for the student of knowledge, and the text reads more like notes that were compiled for the purpose of just clarifying very basics in the science of usul. And so one of the things that he initiates with is the meaning of usul al-fiqh itself. And he is teaching us about how it is that scholars write. So he says, هذه ورقات تجتمع على فصول من أصول الفقه. So then he says that these basically these notes, and we noted that they're not extensive, are compiled of a number of sections, and these sections are sections which pertain to the science of usul al-fiqh. And then therein he gets into the meaning of what usul al-fiqh means, because usul al-fiqh can be understood in two different ways. It can be understood usul al-fiqh as a compound term. You have two different words that are brought together and they make a compound term, and then that compound term basically is talking about the principles for reading, understanding, investigating the Quran and the Sunnah, and extracting from them understanding, or what we call fiqh. That's the simplest way to put it. Research methodology, some say source methodology. So that's one way to look at usul al-fiqh as a compound term. The other way is to take an analytical approach. And an analytical approach demands of us that we understand each term, usul al-fiqh, as being composed of more than one word. And then we look at each word that serves to create the term usul al-fiqh. So we look at the relationship of each term to itself and each term to the others. I prefer to say words, but saying terms is just easier. But usul al-fiqh is considered as a term. Let me clarify that so that way there's no logical confusion here. Usul al-fiqh is understood as a term. Now, we can go two ways about this when we talk about it in the English language. We could talk about usul fiqh as a term being composed of two words, and that's probably the most clearest way to present it. Now, what I did was I was loosened up and I talked about usul fiqh, and I was trying to keep that logic, and then I just ended up calling each word a term, right? There's no harm in that, but at the end of the day, it could be harmful if the student of knowledge is not cognizant. So I want to make sure that I clarify the approach so there can be some systematicity or there can be some consistency in usage. So let's use the term, the concept term, to just represent usul fiqh as a whole. So usul fiqh is a term, it's a concept. Now, that term usul fiqh is composed of more than one word. So if we're in the analytical approach here, we're going to understand what usul fiqh means not as just a compound word, then that means that we're going to have to examine each word, right? And so that's the other approach to looking at the definition of usul fiqh and trying to understand what it is that is meant by usul fiqh. So we have two ways of doing that. One is to look at usul fiqh just as a compound term and that it has a meaning independent of the two individual words. And the other approach is to say, well, hold on a second. This is a term which is composed of words. So we need to understand what each word means and then to understand the relationship between those words before we can determine, what usul fiqh is. And so initially, scholars, they get into these types of discussions uh, to discussions on terminology and language so that there's clarity in the way that we're thinking about these things. Now, usul fiqh overall, uh, it is basically research methodology, and it's teaching us, the principles that are to be used in approaching the Quran and the Sunnah specifically. In this case, uh, when it comes to how to approach Quran and Sunnah, when it comes to how to derive from Quran and Sunnah, understanding as it relates to action, right? There's a lot to be said in that. But overall, I wanted to say that he's dealing with about 24 topics, as we said. Some of these topics, they can be brought together. So he's dealing with some basic terminology. What does it mean? He's dealing with some matters that pertain to the Arabic language, what we call dalalat or linguistics. And then he deals with some points that pertain to the idea of the sunnah. And then he deals with uh, some principles in usul al-fiqh and some concepts that come up, such as abrogation or such as analogy, And so the difference between abrogation and analogy is important to understand that these are two categories that are different in the subject of usul al-fiqh. They're not necessarily related to each other. So when we talk about the concept of abrogation, we're talking about a theory for trying to account for apparent contradictions which may arise between the Quran in itself, the Sunnah in itself, and the Quran and the Sunnah. So the idea of abrogation, as is popularly understood within the discipline of Usul al-Fiqh, is that you have a ruling that comes in one period of time, and then you have a ruling that comes in another period of time. They may contradict each other. So then the question becomes, can we have both rulings or do we have one ruling? And in some cases, you may be able to have more than one ruling. But in the case where you can't have more than one ruling, there's no way to reconcile between the two contradictions. One has to be right and one has to be wrong. So the scholars came up with this idea of what? Of abrogation. They took it to an extreme, but the reality is that that's a logical way of understanding it or dealing with or working through contradictions. The issue of analogy, the issue of analogy is an issue which basically is dealing with how do you apply the Quran and the Sunnah to an unlimited set of situations. So we know how the Quran and Sunnah applied in the time period of the Prophet, but there were only a set of situations that occurred that were we consider to be limited. But how do you apply it to other new situations? Well, the idea of analogy comes in. So basically, the Waraqat, you can say that is dealing with the idea of what is Usul al-Fiqh, and then how it deals with the Quran is really by looking at some key ideas that we need to understand with the language, the Arabic language, and then the idea of the Sunnah that he brings up is just focused on the concept of what initially is focused on the concept that we have to follow everything that the Prophet ﷺ did. And then he deals with, the different types of narration and brief. That we have a narration that's considered widespread, well known, and is considered authentic. And then we have one that is not so widespread, it's not narrated so widely. And so it brings us to the classification of mutawatir and ahad. Mutawatir and ahad. And so these two concepts, the acts of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the categorization of a hadith into mutawatir and ahad, that has to do with the sunnah. So that's where it is that Imam Juwayni takes up the idea of the sunnah. Then majority of the waraqat is dealing with points in language. Majority of the waraqat is dealing with points in language, like when he talks about aqsam al-kalam, or the divisions or the different types of speech that we encounter in the Quran and the Sunnah. Everything that he's talking about issues of, for instance, is there metaphor in the Quran and the Sunnah, the literal meaning, how do we deal with that? And he deals with commands, he deals with prohibitions. Well, there's a form in the language, the Arabic language, that tells us something is a command. There's a form in the Arabic language that tells us something is a prohibition. Then he deals with the general and the specific. He deals with that which is concise and that which is, explained or expounded on. He deals with that which is apparent and that which is interpreted. And then after that, he goes into the acts of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do we have to follow everything that he does or not? And then he goes into the issue of abrogation. Then he goes into the issue of how do we uh, deal with basically contradictions between the different evidences. And that, in many ways, it is tied into the subject of abrogation. We can say that those two subjects come together. But then he comes into the issue of ijma, and then the issue of the statement of the companion. Now, in reality, those come together as well as subjects, because wherein say for instance, just take the example of the time period of the companions where they agree on an issue that's considered consensus. Now then the question comes, can there be a consensus in any other time period outside of the time period of the companions? So he attempts to define what ijma is or consensus is, while at the same time noting that the statement of a companion on a matter of deen is not going to hold this as an individual. It's not going to hold the same weight as when they come together and they agree on the issue. And then he goes into the issue of akhbar, and we mentioned that those are the classification. That's the classification. This section is dealing with the classification of a hadith into mutawatir and ahad. And he even goes into the issue of what is musnad and what is mursal, and that's talking about uh, when you have a chain of narration. How does it, do we classify all of them the same, or do we classify them differently? And so when we talk about how it is that those things are classified, we see that the scholars look at the chain of transmission, and when they find that there's no break in the chain, or when they find, what that means is that it can go all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then they call it musnad. When they call it mursal, it means that there's a break in the chain. So that's another way to classify hadith, by looking at the number, by looking at the connectivity in the chain. Then when you look at the number, of people that transmit the narration, that's when you get into the whole issue of mutawatir and ahad. Then he gets into the issue of qiyas, which is basically analogy, and then it comes back to the issue of prohibition and permissibility, and he gets into the topic of istishab. The topic of istishab is that a matter is presumed to be as it is, and that is to be permissible unless there's an evidence that says to the contrary, right? And so that's just a principle in the Sharia that comes up of what do you do in the case where there may not be a clear evidence, right? And there's nothing said on that particular topic. And anyway, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but all I want to say is that the student should be conscious that these topics overlap with each other, and in reality, you can create a couple different, I would say, few different categories, about three different categories to what it is that he's talking about here. So some things pertain to language, something pertain to a hadith, and something pertain to uh, principles that are utilized in researching Quran and the Sunnah, and who it is that's qualified or not qualified to do that research, right? And so those are the three areas that Imam Juwayni is hitting on. And in reality, if you were to print the waraqat, like on a piece of loose leaf paper or something like that, or even just a regular print, if, like a notebook standard size, you're not going to find that he's covering a lot of ground, right? So he's just hitting on the main points that need to be brought up in Usul Fiqh, and hopefully, if there's some time, uh, I would like to come back to the text to explain it section by section. But the idea that I wanted to communicate here is that in reality, the student of knowledge should have an understanding that sometimes the text may seem not to flow in terms of the topics, and how it may not be clear what is the relationship between these different themes that he covers, which is about 24 themes. And so you have to look for, how it is that you can organize your thoughts about it so that you can see that they are interrelated with each other. Yes, there's books that are more systematically organized or better organized than this small text, but there's a lot of benefit in this text. And after everything is said and done, if a teacher really knows how to use the text and they can present to the student the internal logic, of what's going on, and present the themes in a better systematic way, then the text becomes no doubt foundational and a key to easily understand uh, the subject matter of usul fiqh at a very foundational basic level, and it'll help to establish what it is that needs to be established as far as the basics of understand to go to larger texts or to go to a more in-depth discussion. And so with that, we end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.